This is a 2004 Ferrari 360 Modena, and it's the perfect Ferrari for people who are afraid to own a Ferrari. You're worried about big repair bills, unreliability, questionable workmanship on the older models, or a high sticker price on the newer models. This is the perfect in-between. Today I'm going to review this 360 and show you all of its quirks and features. Before I get started, big news, this Ferrari 360 is currently for sale and it's being auctioned live on Cars and Bids. This 360 is from the final model year and it has a gated 6-speed manual transmission. It's the one that everybody wants and it can be yours on Cars and Bids. So once you finish watching this video, click the link in the description below to visit the live auction for this 360 where you can bid on it and buy it only on Cars and Bids. All right, time for the quirks and features of the Ferrari 360 Modena, and I'm going to start with a little overview. This was Ferrari's entry-level mid-engine V8 model, and it was sold from 1999 through 2005. It replaced the F355, the beautiful, stunning, gorgeous, head-turningly amazing, but ultimately tremendously unreliable and problematic F355, and it came before the F430, which is more exciting and faster, but obviously more expensive as well. This is a nice middle ground between the two. The 360 used a 3.6-liter V8, hence the name, and made about 400 horsepower, and that, combined with a curb weight of around 3,400 pounds, meant 0 to 60 in the mid 4-second range, which is still pretty quick today and was especially respectable 20 years ago when this car came out. So on to the quirks and features. Let's start with getting in, where we have an interesting door handle situation. You can see the door handle is sort of triangular shaped and mounted near the top of the door. It was meant to fit in with the lines of this air intake that goes deeper into the rear fender. Shaping it like this was supposed to hide it in the air intake so you wouldn't necessarily notice an ugly protruding door handle. Ferrari was always trying to get creative with hiding their door handles, but never their keyholes, which you can see this one is just sticking out front and center, plainly mounted right there on the door, not hidden at all. But the door handle, that had to conform to the shape of the air intake, so maybe you wouldn't notice it. But anyway, you lift up that door handle, open the door, climb inside, and you're greeted by an interesting mixture of modern and old school in here. For example, the climate control. In the 360, the climate control works. That's a big deal because previous Ferrari models, well, it did or didn't work to varying degrees. Sometimes it didn't blow out enough air, sometimes it just wasn't operating properly and it was hard to make it work, but in the 360, you wanted air conditioning, you got it. You wanted heat, you got it. It always worked well. It blew out a lot of air. It was great, except to turn it off, you didn't just turn this dial down to 0, you had to press this bizarre stop button in addition, which seems like this weird old school touch that somehow made it into a modern Ferrari. Same deal on the gauge cluster. This car has a screen in the gauge cluster, which would have been very advanced for its debut in 1999. But the screen is this tiny little thing that shows this ridiculous pixelated image of the car from above when a door is open, almost like something a child would do. That's supposed to represent the 360. It's hard to imagine screens have evolved so much in such a little time. Another interesting old school touch in the gauge cluster is with the turn signals. You turn on a turn signal and it tells you they're on, but it doesn't specify which turn signal is on, which was a common thing from cars in the 50s and 60s, but somehow it lasted all the way through the 2000s in Ferraris. Despite these old school touches, it is important to point out that the interior of the 360 is far more modern than the Ferraris that came before it. I've recently spent a lot of time in a 355, and I shot a video with the 328, two of the direct predecessors to this car, and their interiors were so much older. The 360s just feels more modern than its predecessors, which is usually the case for a newer car, but here it seems to be a line-drawn distinction, the 360 versus the 355. 355 feels more vintage to me, and the 360 just doesn't. It feels like a more modern car in this interior. The exception to that, however, is of course the gated manual transmission. You can see 6-speed gated manual just like the enthusiasts want nowadays. It is the coolest feature of this car, and of course a bit of a vintage throwback, because the 360 was really the beginning of Ferrari's large-scale transition away from 3-pedal manual transmissions. The F1 paddle shift automatic had been introduced with the 355, but only at the very end of its model range, so it wasn't on too many cars. With the 360, most estimates say 70 to 75% were equipped with the F1 paddle shift transmission. And of course, as these cars have aged, enthusiasts have come to desire the manual more, making the remaining 20 to 25 to 30% of manual cars that much more desirable. Over the years, Ferrari built around 16,500 360s, so it's not all that common and especially rare with 3 pedals like this car. But anyway, let's talk through some other interesting quirks and features of the 360. For one thing, this car has manual seats. Power-operated seats were an option. This car doesn't have it, which may seem less desirable, but it came with an interesting benefit. 360s with manual seats had more headroom. Because of the seat and motor mechanism situation, the placement of the seats was lower in manual seat cars, and so tall drivers will want to be on the lookout for a manual seat, manual transmission 360. We want everything manual in this car. Also interesting, in the 360, to the left of the steering wheel, you had a switch that turned on sport mode, which is kind of ridiculous. You buy a Ferrari with a big screaming V8, a gated manual transmission, and you still got to put it in sport mode. In later Ferraris, they realized that was stupid, and sport became the default mode, and of course you could go into race if you wanted to be even sportier. Also interesting in this car is the horn, activated with this sort of hidden button pad on the steering wheel. You press it and, well, take a listen. Ah, the old school, absurd Ferrari horn sound. Another unusual item in this interior, the button to release the trunk to open it and to release the fuel doors hidden under this silver panel. You pop these open and there they are. Now on previous Ferrari models, these buttons were out in the open, but Ferrari covered them on the 360. I guess they were trying to class things up a bit and get more modern. I've talked about how it's a more modern interior, and apparently that was one way they did it. Now, despite the fact that this is a more modern place to spend time than earlier models, it's also pretty basic. It doesn't have screens or swoopy styling details or crazy interior touches. You don't get a lot of that stuff in here. This, the 360, still hailed from an era when Ferrari was all about sort of basic, focused performance, and you can tell that in this interior. Not quite as quirky as you might think. But anyway, next up, let's talk through stuff that opens on the outside, starting with the engine cover, which had the impressive distinction of being clear glass on the top to show you the engine from outside the car. These days, that's become common. A lot of cars have glass so you can see the engine, but in the days of the 360, it was a revolution. You could see the powertrain, show it off, flex to people around you without ever opening the engine cover and looking like you were trying too hard to flex. It was a big deal, and this car was one of the very first that did it, especially at a relatively attainable price point. But you open up the engine lid and you quickly discover that it is absolutely beautiful in here. This gorgeous engine, not just what you can see with it closed, but when everything's open, it really looks fantastic. The way it's laid out, the red coloring, this is how an exotic car powertrain should look. And it's just so special back here. Even though this is only a 360, a relatively affordable, attainable Ferrari, it's still beautiful in the engine bay. And also in the engine bay, you can see the exhaust. There's an aftermarket Capristo system on this car, which really brings out the sound. Take a listen to this 360 revving. And next up, we move on to the other large opening compartment, and that would be the front trunk, which is surprisingly large, actually. You look in here and there's a decent amount of space for you to put stuff. If you want to take this car on a nice weekend getaway, it can be reasonably practical. And this is in addition to the storage space behind the seats. There's decent space back there and some netting where you can stick stuff, but you could also probably fit a small bag or briefcase behind those seats. And then you have this front storage. It's a decently practical car, and it comes with some nice little goodies in the front trunk. This bag that's strapped with these leather straps in the back, that's the tire inflator kit should you have a flat, but more interesting is the other group of leather accessories back here. Specifically, this includes the car's owner's manuals and books and the tool kit, which comes in this bizarre leather, almost looks like a briefcase. They really expected you to do some work with these tools. Of course, in a modern Ferrari, you could never really do anything with the provided toolkit. They just include it, I guess, for heritage. But in this car, you get the sense, at least, that you could get dirty and actually do some work with the Ferrari provided tools. Now, also in the front trunk, underneath the trunk lid itself, you can see the factory stamped color code for this car, Giallo Modena, which means, well, Modena yellow. Perfectly fitting for this, the 360 Modena. And speaking of the 360, a little bit more overview. Recently I reviewed the high performance version of this car, which was called the 360 Challenge Stradale. That car has some nice benefits over the standard 360. It had a little extra horsepower, it was lowered, a more aggressive look, lighter weight, but it was only offered with an automatic transmission, the F1 paddle shift. That was the fastest Ferrari was making, and so they figured the fast performance car should have the fast performance transmission. If you want a manual, you have to get a regular Modena model like this one. And this is one of the more desirable versions, being a later production car. Like I said, the 360 came out in '99. The early ones had a couple issues, but it was pretty much worked out by '04. This is known to be a fairly reliable, reasonable to own Ferrari, and you can get it with a gated manual transmission to enhance the experience like this car has. All right, driving the 360 Modena. Now, if you've been watching my channel for a long time, and I mean a long time, you know that I used to own one of these. Way back in the day, I had an '04 360, and I was kind of lukewarm about it at the time, but I think that's partially because, well, I had wrapped up my entire net worth in that car, and it just made me so nervous to own, and it never quite did what I wanted it to from like a coolness or emotion standpoint. But with time, my perspective on the 360 has changed quite a bit, mostly because values have kind of stayed where they were, suggesting that this car is a pretty good one if you just want to get a car that's going to hold a value, have a fun exotic sports car and not lose anything. But also, one important thing, I just started to kind of come to the realization that this is a great entry point into the world of Ferrari. The 355 is far more beautiful, everybody agrees, but it's really unreliable, like very much so, and you really don't want to go down that road. The 430 is amazing, but you can't find a manual, and when you do, they're $1 zillion. And so this car, I've started to kind of think of it as just a great, for what it is, it's a great car. For the price point, which is about the same as a brand new Porsche 911. I mean, here you have a Ferrari with a gated manual and a high-strung V8 that sounds like this. Listen to that shift gate click then. I don't know, I think that the thing about this car is I think it's just cool for the money and for what it is. I think if you try to assume that this is going to be the most head-turningly awesome exotic car ever, it won't be. But it's a damn good sports car, and it's the first Ferrari that you can really trust. It's the first Ferrari that you really feel like you can believe is going to start every time, and you're going to take it into the shop and you're not going to get a $25,000 random repair bill. It's the first Ferrari that can like do everything you want it to. And this is a cool one. Manual transmission in this yellow color, late production. That's what you wanted with the 360. Like I mentioned, there were some issues on the earlier cars, but they were really resolved by the 02, 03, 04s. So this is kind of a second to last model. Your 05 was convertible only. But this is just a simple yet great car. So much more drama, so much more occasion than a regular Porsche 911, something like that. This car is also appealing because it has 24,000 miles, so not too high, but also not so low that you can't drive it. I mean, that's just great. It's not the fastest, but it's fast enough. It's not the most head-turning, but it's head-turning enough. And it's just plain cooler than so many other cars at this price point. When you consider like the low $100,000 range and what a 997 turbo or something, it's a cool car also, but this is just more occasion. And I totally get why someone would prefer this over that. And I love the sound, and I love the precision feel of it, and I just think it's cool. I mean, imagine driving this around and kind of throwing it around corners and just knowing you're not really gonna lose much money in it, and it probably won't cost you much to own. This is kind of the sweet spot Ferrari. Still mechanical, still focused, no screens, no gimmicks, just a fun, naturally aspirated, nice sounding V8 and a stick to stir it with. And so that's the 2004 Ferrari 360 Modena, the reasonably priced, reasonably powered, reasonable to own Ferrari. And yet it's still cool with a gated 6-speed manual transmission, and it makes the right sounds. And you can buy this one on Cars and Bids. Anyway, now it's time to give this 360 a DougScore. And the DougScore is here, 60 out of 100, which places the Ferrari 360 here against similar cars from its era. It ties the 996 Porsche 911 Turbo, but the results are exactly as you'd expect. The 996 has a better daily score as it's more practical and usable. The Ferrari has a better weekend score as it's more fun and exciting. Frankly, I think the 360 is settled into a great position in the Ferrari world, providing exotic styling, a great sound, and great performance, plus pretty decent reliability for relatively affordable pricing that doesn't seem to be losing value.